to the Infrastructure Services Networks Committee meeting, and sorry about the late delay for those that are waiting upon us. Forum today, and we've got Amina Sama talking on behalf of the developers of the property on Riccarton Road. Thank you for pre-circulating your information. Now, yeah, just push the button.
Awesome. Cool, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amina Osama, and I'm here on behalf of AK Geo Limited. Now, my client recently submitted a road naming application for a subdivision of Riccarton Road. The council has recommended that the use of the suffix wind be rejected, despite the council admitting that the road name complies with the Dunedin road naming policy. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is just take you through 5 issues that we've identified with the report, and we request that the committee accept the road naming application on the strength of our analysis. So if you just turn to the second page. So the first issue that the council identified was that the meaning wind does not fit the use of the road in this context. There are 2 different definitions of wind, the first being a turning off the main street. Now, looking at the current proposal, the main street is a Riccarton Road, and the Wakefield wind will turn off that road. So it is a turning off the main street. The second definition of wind that is also commonly used is a narrow street. In order to determine what is narrow, we have to look at the surrounding circumstances. Now, in this case, there is, as I mentioned, Riccarton Road and State Highway 1 in very close proximity to this road. Both of those have a width of 20 metres, whilst Wakefield wind will only have a width of 16 metres. So in that context, it is narrow. Now turning on to the next page. So the council in their report has identified that because wind is not specified in the Australian New Zealand addressing standards, it cannot be accepted as a road. Now, we submit that the decision must be made in light of the Dunedin road naming policy, and the road naming policy does not refer to this addressing standard at all. And even if it did, the addressing standard doesn't prohibit the use of suffixes that are not included within it. The council has alluded to the fact that it will be altering the road naming policy to refer to the addressing standards. Now, although there may be a plan to do this, we believe that the council is bound to assess the application on the road naming policy as it stands. Now, my client has accorded with the road naming policy and has put a lot of time and a lot of money and effort into it. It's ticked all the boxes. We think it will be a disservice to my client if it is rejected for something that the road naming policy does not refer to. So we largely believe that the New Zealand and Australian addressing standards are irrelevant for the purposes of this proposal. Now, the third issue is that the general public does not know what wind means, doesn't know how to spell it or how to pronounce it. In terms of the spelling of wind, we don't think this will be an issue. Wind is going to be unique to the Otago and Dunedin region. So all that will need to be done is for Wakefield to be typed into a search engine, and wind will automatically be recommended as the full road name. There are also plenty of other road names out there that are hard to spell, hard to pronounce. Now, that has never been a barrier for them being accepted, so we don't think that it should be in this case either. In terms of the meaning of wind, there are a handful of suffixes out there that also have their meanings unknown. And we think this lack of meaning will only be a temporary issue in the sense that it will clearly be part of a blue road signs, so it'll be relatively obvious what it is. And it's quite easy to do a quick Google search to find out what wine actually means, and if it leads to people's vocabulary being expanded, we don't see how that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, the last two issues relate to concerns that the confusion in what wine means will lead to a delay in emergency responses. Now, the first point of contact in any emergency call is the communications centre. Now, for Dunedin, that's the Southern Communications Centre. If it gets past that phase, then any chance of confusion is hugely mitigated. Now, we contacted the shift supervisor, Brett Watkins, at the Southern Communications Centre. He advised us that wind will not cause confusion, and so that is no longer an issue. We also notified Emergency Otago, who had originally opposed the road naming application, that the Southern Communications Centre no longer had a problem, and Emergency Otago has changed their position on it. So just to sum up, there has been no issue in terms of confusion for emergency services. The use of the term wind satisfies the definition of this situation. The New Zealand and Australian addressing standards is not relevant for deciding this application, and my client has put a lot of time, effort and money into this application. He's ticked all the boxes, and we therefore think, because it complies with the road naming policy, that it should be accepted. Thank you.
Are you happy to take some questions?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Questions, Councillor Fiso?
Thank you for your time and your presentation. I personally have no problems with wind, and I will defer to the process when it comes to the council deciding. But if your client had to compromise between Wakefield and wind, what do you think he's likely to go for? Because in my opinion, I would not support the name itself, given what I perceive to be Edward Gibbon Wakefield's deplorable history in terms of his conceiving the New Zealand company idea while in prison for seducing an heiress. So I would be opposed to Wakefield more than I would be opposed to wine. So how would your client be likely to respond, do you think?
In the actual road naming application, we did recognise the more than questionable acts that Wakefield himself had undertaken, whilst also submitting that any one person's actions should always be considered in light of the circumstances they lived, the societal context. For example, there are many historical figures who, looking at some of their actions through the lens of today's society, through the benefit of hindsight, their actions were deplorable. Malcolm X was incredibly violent. Gandhi was incredibly racist himself. So we feel as though criticising him based on things that were normal in that culture perhaps should be overlooked in this situation. In terms of an alternative, though, he's very set on Wakefield Wind.
Councillor Gary?
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask about, because one of the recommendations of our road naming policy is to provide an alternative, and you didn't provide an alternative in this case. So what I would like to know is, if you were providing an alternative, what would it be? And secondly, if you were choosing between the options for the suffix, what would it be? Would it be way? Is it alliterative? Is that what the client's looking for? As in Wakefield way, or close or place of the ones provided?
I've been instructed that we don't want to put forward any alternative, in the sense that this is Wakefield wine is what my client is very is essentially what he wants. Yeah.
Can I just taking point further, if we choose to accept staff advice today,
Yep.
and not to accept that, you realise that will make the process longer for your client. That will have
Yes.
to come back again later. You're aware of that, and he's
He is
aware of that.
yes.
Thank you. Councillor O'Malley.
Actually, just it's going to be a comment, then a question. I've actually been to where Malcolm X was assassinated, and before he was assassinated, he gave up violence. So
Indeed, yes.
I don't think Mr. Wakefield renounced his attitudes towards settlement before he died. Yeah. If we are to put city streets to a certain width and they have to meet compliance and the definition of wind is narrow, then obviously we're not going to ever be able to put a street in that would relationship between the narrowness as defined and a standard street that now has to go in. So I guess in that interpretation, would you assume then that wind will never be able to be used in the future, even if it got onto the standards? It was the second point of rejection here. That
I'm not entirely sure what the question is, sorry.
if it has to be a narrow street coming off a big street, and none of our streets in the modern era can be particularly narrow because we have to build them to a certain width, then we'll never be able to build a wind in the future. So are we now forced through that rather unusual requirement that we fit the dictionary definition of wind, that even if it got back on the Australian standards, we'd never be able to use it? I mean, I guess I'm pointing out, I'm sort of agreeing with you on that second point.
Yeah, I
definitions
think
become
that's definitely
redundant,
valid.
is really what I'm saying.
There's also already a precedent for it being used. It's used in the Taupo district as a mark wind. That one's 20 metres, so it has already been used in a wider context than here, also been used throughout Australia.
And there does not appear to be any Wakefield streets at all in Dunedin in any
No,
form.
not in Dunedin. There's quite a few on the North Island.
So even if you called in and said, I've had an emergency event at Wakefield Wind, they'd only have one Wakefield anything they can send you to anyway, right?
Sorry, what was that?
Well, there's the issue of whether or not having Wind as the second part of the name of the street could be a source of confusion in the case of an emergency. But the first part will always be Wakefield. So therefore, if there's no other Wakefield anything, so there's no Wakefield Street or Wakefield Close, then even if it was Wakefield Wind, you'd still only have one place to choose, even if you didn't capture the
I
second
mean, you
part.
type in Wakefield, there's only one suggestion, and it's going to be a wind.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Thank you.
Councillor Wiley, and Councillor Vandervis, do you have any questions?
No, but thank you very much for remembering me.
I won't forget you. Well, I shall ask you at the beginning or the end each time, I promise you. Councillor Wiley?
Yeah, the lights are still on, so we're okay. Summer, can you just answer one question for me in regards to your
Certainly.
client? Can you tell me what is wrong with close, place, or way? Why weren't those three considered or put forth as alternatives? What was wrong with close, place, and way?
Well, originally, Wakefield Wind was proposed. After it was originally rejected by the council, my client was asked for alternatives, to which, given the time and effort and money he'd already put into the application, he didn't want to give, kind of as a matter of principle, because he had complied with the policy, and he therefore saw no reason that it should be rejected. So in terms of the alternatives, he wants Wind simply because he likes it.
Mr. Osama, it'd be very helpful. You keep on talking about the costs and everything for this. Can you just explain what those costs are, apart from the fact that he's advertising it under the name Wycliffe Wind already?
Well, yeah, because, I mean, it's a subdivision. I think there's 16 lots, and it's been marketed all on the term Wakefield Wind well before the application was actually put in.
So he chose to do that knowing that the street name process could be done at any stage?
He did that knowing that, or believing that Wakefield Wind would comply with the road naming policy, and therefore he did all his marketing based on Wakefield Wind, and then subsequently to that, we have gone through this process, and so there's the legal fees involved.
Thank you. Councillor Benson-Pope?
How many of those sections have been sold?
As of 1 week ago, maybe 2 or 3. I'm not 100% sure, sorry.
Perhaps the marketing under a different and approved name might actually help sales.
I won't
Sorry,
be
it
an expert on that.
wasn't a question.
Thank you, Councillor Benson-Pope. That, I think, is the end of the questions. Thank you for your attendance, Mr Sama.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We'll be dealing with that matter later on the agenda. Second up for the public forum is Lindy Hood. Thank you very much. You're coming to talk about the cycleways, and I think if people go to attachment L, I think is the... yeah. And thank you for your paperwork too. Yeah. You just need to push the button at the bottom. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm from Victor, Visual Impairment Charitable Trust Aotearoa. Our members are among Dunedin's 20,000 older folk who live active, independent, socially engaged lives in our city. They strongly support cycling and cycling safety, but not at the expense of our most vulnerable road users, pedestrians. This submission goes wider. I'm asking you to consider the active transport needs of locals of all ages and abilities who lack the strength and balance and skills to ride a bike, or the reflexes to jump out of the way of a bike, or who can't afford a bike, and to consider all of us who would rather walk than bike because walking means travelling at the pace of thought. It's the only form of transport in which mind, body and the environment can be wonderfully synchronised. When we walk, we're actually in the environment, not just passing through it. The cycleway report you're considering ignores the concerns of pedestrians. I have a simple, low-cost solution, but first I need you to understand why it's so important. On cycleway issues, council staff consult cycling, motoring, business, landowning and law enforcement interests. But this project includes shared paths shared with pedestrians. Pedestrians weren't consulted, and when they raised their concerns, they were ignored. I know the NZTA holds the purse strings, and they only fund cycleways. But you can't make the problem go away by building cycleways and calling them shared paths. You'll see from the graph on page 2 of our submission that the people who do most of the walking, there's a graph from Sport New Zealand for recreation and one from the Ministry of Transport for how people get around. And obviously walking is very, very important. The people who do most of the walking are too young or too old to drive. You can see from those graphs. Those kids should be free to run around. And those oldies are the canaries in the coal mine of Dunedin's future. They want to keep active. It's in the best interest of their health, for the economy and the environment. Their numbers are escalating and they hate shared paths. Heaps of people wrote to Parliament recently to say that walking and cycling don't mix. Some of their comments are on page 3 and 4 of our submissions. I'll just read you a few. The advent of well-intentioned shared paths is already making walking more stressful for pedestrians, especially for the elderly and those of us with young families. Imagine taking a child along a walkway. You want the child to be able to run forward, see a bird, stop and watch it for a while, then run to the other side of the track to look down the stream, and then spot another bird and follow it to the other side of the track, and then be distracted by an interesting fern, and so on. That behaviour is not possible if there's a risk that a fast cyclist will come around the corner. I'm elderly, I have hearing difficulties, but my biggest problem is my personal balance. The footpath is now the only place left for me to walk safely, as all walkways are used by cyclists. Try walking around the Farm Cove walkway in Pakuranga and see how you get on. Those cyclists are not aware of sharing with care, and in fact it's frightening. As people age and start to slow down, lose their hearing and sight, should they not walk because of the dangers imposed by cyclists on paths? Our traffic planners must know that all the international guidelines, including the ones linked to the NZTA website, say that if you've got the space, the best way to avoid conflict between pedestrians and cyclists is to have totally separate walkways and cycleways. We need to future-proof our city. We need to make it an accessible, inclusive, wonderful place to live. A good place to start is by having a separate walkway at street level along the harbour front between Friat and Birch Streets for 3 good reasons. First, there's plenty of room, no excuses there. Second, cyclists will enter both ends of the cycleway from the road at motor vehicle speed. Why should they slow down? They don't want to smell the roses. They want to enjoy whizzing along at car-free space. Third, a refreshing stroll along a centrally located, safe, street-level harbourfront walkway with a gorgeous view will be a joy for people of all ages and abilities. People walk there now, and they'll walk them in much greater numbers in the future. All those old people are going to stop driving sooner or later, and they're not going to go and jump on bikes. If you don't have the funds for a separate walkway now, then please set aside the land for it now and prioritise its construction in a future DCC budget. I'll close with the wisdom of Diogenes, solvitur ambulando, it is solved by walking. Thank you.
Thank you. Lindley, are you happy to take some questions?
Sorry?
Are you happy to take questions?
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Vandervis, have you got any questions?
No, all very clear, thank you.
Okay. Just for clarity, it's just the steamer basin section, which is the shared path, that you're most concerned about?
Yeah.
Yep, thank you.
And I'm not saying build it now, I'm saying
Yeah.
just make sure there's space for a walkway.
Thank you. Any questions or is clarity of the message? Great. There are no questions. Thank you very, very much for you coming along.
Thank you.
We'll be discussing that in due course if you want to stay and listen to the debate.